That Triathlon Show 369. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Olav Aleksander Bu. Olav, as you are probably aware, is the coach of Kristian Blummenfelt and Gustav Iden. He was first on the podcast back in 2020 in episode number 264, when I think very few people had heard his name. And now if you follow triathlon, of course, you know who he is. And I'm really happy to welcome him back for another in-depth discussion of training, racing, science and coaching, and what makes Kristian and Gustav such exceptional athletes, with this year having won the Ironman World Championships in St. George on Kristian's side, and in Kona on Gustav's side, and also Kristian winning the Ironman 73 world title in St. George. But before we get into the interview, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that create sports nutrition products, both fueling and hydration products, and they help you use them effectively through a range of free tools, services, and content. The Fuel and Hydration Planner on their website is a one-stop shop for figuring out an effective race hydration and fueling strategy for you. It's free and super easy to use. It only takes a couple of minutes to answer a handful of questions, and then you get a detailed, simple, and effective race plan. They also offer free video consultations, and as a listener of the podcast, you can get 15% off your first order of the range of electrolyte and carbohydrate products by using the code TTS22 at checkout on precisionfuelandhydration.com. And thank you to Zen8. The Zen8 indoor swim trainer is a unique dryland swim trainer that allows you to improve your technique, power, and swim training consistency. It is a perfect tool to complement your pool and open water swimming, as it allows you to do very specific power and technique work, including working on your catch and your core activation, and it makes it easier to stay consistent even when you can't go to the pool. You can even use it to do activation work before a pool or open water swim, or to do swim bike brick workouts more easily. You can try the Zen8 risk-free for up to 30 days, so if you don't love it, just send it back, and you can get a special bundle including the swim bench and a bunch of Zen8 training plans and on-demand workouts on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Alright, so just a quick heads up, as I know not everybody might be completely familiar with the abbreviation WTCS, which we throw around a lot in this episode. It means the World Triathlon Championship Series, which is the highest level of racing in short course triathlon. And when we talk about races like Bermuda, the Grand Final in Abu Dhabi, and Edmonton, which was the Grand Final last year, those are all WTCS races, just to make that clear so you can follow along in the context of the discussion. We don't really have much of an introduction here, but we jump straight into the content. But if you're interested in more about Olav himself personally and his background, then do go back and listen to my first interview with him, where we started off talking about that. And it is a very interesting background, so it's well worth listening. Now let's hear the interview with Olav Aleksander Bu. Welcome back to That Triathlon Show, Olav Aleksander. How are you doing?
Thanks. Good. It's nice to be done with the season and actually be able to sit down and have some interesting conversations with people like yourself.
Yeah, thank you. You're sitting down, but you're still kind of working, as we just talked about briefly. Do you want to share with the listeners what you're up to right now?
So, of course, we are continuously looking to optimize our program. So that means that I am on a journey in Morocco at the moment to see if we can find even better altitude locations for our training moving into Paris 2024.
And what is the altitude there where you are?
So currently I'm a little bit lower, but we are going up to a location which is situated around 2,800 meters. So it's a tad more aggressive than I would ideally like, but this is of course where we're looking to maybe make some changes in the program and see if we're able to make the next step.
Yeah, absolutely. And Paris is looming large. We had, as we're speaking now, we just had the Grand Final happening a few days ago. First of all, how did you and the athletes feel about the Grand Final?
Of course, it was a very short time after Kona and St. George World Championship, so long course races. So we knew that what the time that we had available, it was very limited what we would be able to do. Also because of the travels between US and Europe. Before Bermuda, of course, between Bermuda and St. George, it was only 1 week. And then with travels and everything, there's basically nothing you can do than recover, more or less, and maybe get in some workouts. But our goal was that, okay, Bermuda would be what Bermuda became, or whatever it would result in. The performance there was exceeding our expectations. Our goal for Abu Dhabi was to place top 10. Kristian came 8th place in Abu Dhabi. Gustav, unfortunately, didn't feel too well out on the bike already. So for him, we could maybe say that in just from an ideal perspective, of course, we would like to have him top 10 as well. But with the performance that we had in Bermuda, we are very positive for the return and the very little work we have had working, or the ability we've had to work on higher speeds or specificity required to be competitive in VTCS racing.
Yeah, and Paris, of course, you still have a lot of time to work for that, so that will be a completely different story, I'm sure, than having barely time to do any specific workouts. With that being said, looking back at this year of long distance focus, was it what you expected it to be in terms of the performances and results, or did it exceed expectations, or what were your thoughts around that?
No, I would say it was pretty much on par with what we could expect. Of course, there were some changes throughout the year because of other interests and other things, so which made, of course, a little bit more noise in the program. But I would say that pretty much on par. Of course, I would like it to be even faster in Kona than what it was, but improving the record by that much still it's good. But I'm fairly confident, like I said before Kona, and I think I can reinforcing here, and that is that the times in Kona we will see them go below. How much faster than 7:30? That I don't know, but that we will be able to go faster than 7:30, so 7:29 or something is completely doable in Kona with enough time to specialize for it.
Yeah, and we might get to that topic a little bit later on. I do want to talk about the level of racing and so on, the competition in long distance. But looking ahead to next year, going back onto the WTCS circuit, I'm still wondering, will Kristian and Gustav do any long distance races in 2023? I think everybody's wondering that. What can you share about that? So,
of course, everything depends on the return back to VTCS racing now. If we see that we are ahead of schedule. So originally, we were discussing a little bit what our expectations are and so on. And I don't think that we will... Initially, our expectation were that being able to stabilize the performance on the podium in VTCS racing will probably take at least another half year before we are there. So first part of the season will be more dialing back in and figuring out what kind of changes we have to make to the program now in order to become competitive at the podium again. If we see that we are ahead of schedule and things goes much faster than what we expect, that will of course open up the possibilities to start to do long course racing again. But if we see that we really need the time to stabilize the performance at the highest level in VTCS racing again, then of course it will be too much of a risk going back, doing long course racing and mixing it up with that. So it depends. It depends very much on how fast we're able to bring it back to highest level in VTCS racing again.
Yeah, and does that include even races like the shorter 100K distance races that the PTO put up, or would that be possible more easily to combine with the WTCS?
So I think the half Ironman and PTO races are absolutely more doable without having the same impact on racing and specialization as the Ironman racing does. So absolutely, PTO and half Ironman races are more likely to happen. Long or the full distance like Ironman, that's and will entirely depend on how quickly we are able to stabilize the performance.
Yeah. What is this is something I should have checked, but what is the calendar out for next year for the WTCS series? When, because this year the first race happened quite late in May in Yokohama, I believe. And of course it ended late towards the end of November just now. Is the schedule out for next year already?
Parts of it is out. The two first races, there might be some new recent updates happen now this week or previous week. But last I checked, the last race the last race I saw now that came back on table early in the season was actually Abu Dhabi. So Abu Dhabi will actually happen again the 4th of March. And then I think the schedule on VTCS level is quite open yet until Yokohama happening late May. So first race is 4th of March back in Abu Dhabi.
All right. Yeah. Then regarding going from a long distance focus this year and going back and focusing on Paris and short distance racing, what do you think are the biggest challenges with that, and why do you think nobody has managed to do that successfully? To be honest, like maybe not that many people have even tried, because generally, historically, people have stepped up from short distance to long distance. And maybe some of them have dabbled in both, like Alistair Brownlee, Javier Gomez, and the likes. But even in those examples, you seem to see that those athletes that have tried to do both have not really been that successful in either, almost. And nobody has really gone from focusing completely on one to focusing to going to long distance and then focusing completely on short distance again, as far as I can remember. But do you think basically, what do you think are the challenges with going back from long distance to short distance?
It's a little bit hard to tell, and of course that's but that is the challenge that we really like. Of course, on the one side, it can be age, just as simple as that. That when a lot of the athletes has been transitioning from short course to long course, they have been a little bit more towards the end of the career. They start to feel that their performance in the short course are falling behind, and they transition to long course where it has been easier to be competitive before. I think that will also change. But there might also be that, and this is of course this is a part we do study now, and that is also that there are structural changes also happening that is actually that takes more time to reverse, or not necessarily let's not call it necessarily a reverse, but you could call it a kind of a reverse, but basically bring the structural changes back to VTCS racing, or the speed and dynamics required in VTCS racing. So really, what is the main cause will still remain speculations, but age can be one factor for sure, but also purely muscular, structural, cardiovascular changes can be another factor. Thirdly, also, I think mixing them both up at the highest level, that will require more volume in the training than what has maybe most athletes have been normal to do or used to do, even at very high level or highest level. We have done, that was also the reason for after the Olympics or before the Olympics and after Olympics, we did a lot of tests, some targeted, some untargeted, everything from down to mRNA and proteomics, all the way to more known forms of testing from, of course, lab testing that we have done plenty of, to EMG studies and so. And then following them on regular basis throughout the year now until we're going to end actually that part now in December. And then basically when we now start to go back again, it's a little bit, I use a little bit the metaphor that it's like if you have water and that has a pH of 7, and if you pour into something that is, let's call the VTSS racing more acidic and the Ironman racing more alkaline. So now basically when you are transitioning from the, let's say, the more acidic racing to a more alkaline part, that to bring it back. So if we said that Kristian was representing the perfect balance of pH 7, after that was the reference going out of the Olympics. Now it becomes more alkaline. There are two ways, of course, to try to bring this back to that, let's say, pH 7. One, if of course, that you just pour in an infinitive amount of specificity, so that you dilute it from that, let's say, more alkaline gradually back down to pH 7. But do you ever come back really to a pH 7, or is it 7 point something? And at this level, we are talking about margins. Or can we do that even faster by pouring in some acidity in there, and to bring it much faster back to that pH 7, for example? And now with all the studies we have done, we have, of course, a good picture, but we don't know 100%. We just have to go a little bit experimental training with, of course, much the same as before, but with some more specificity or some other changes, trying to bring it faster back to Olympic level. But it is a learning process. It is a learning process to figure out what really works to bring it as quickly as possible back to Olympic level.
When you mentioned structural and muscular differences or changes that are required, what do you refer to? Is it like actual muscle fiber typology or some metabolic changes within the muscle? What is specifically that you mean?
Well, that can be some parts of it, but of course that's again the difficulty with physiology is that there are of course parts we can measure, but there are even more we can't measure. So in the end, of course, it will always come back to measuring performance as a function of speed or power. Metabolics is starting already to get a little bit too far away, but it is exactly like, for example, structural changes to muscle fiber typology, recruitment, structural changes to the heart, for example. One thing that we do know, for example, in Ironman is that you don't really need an equally big heart in Ironman racing as you do in VTSS racing, just because the power output is much lower, the oxygen consumption is going to be much lower, and one can imagine that it takes some time to cause enough both time and stimulus to let's say, call it, grow the heart big enough to really be both let's say powerful enough for VTS racing, that when you come down and you do long course racing for a longer period and you want to go back to this, that takes time. But also as we age, of course, the flexibility also is reduced in everything from muscle fibers and other things. So that means also that the stimulus required to, let's say, build it back also, or the plasticity or flexibility is also less. So it also requires a different stimulus to bring it back there again. To be honest, I really don't know. If I knew, it would be very simple, but that's of course the interesting part with it, that we don't know. We just have a lot of ideas, theories about what potentially can be the causes, then trying, of course, to find metrics or way to quantify it, and then, of course, learn as we go what really is changing, and when we are trying to change it back, then understand more the resistance, or if there are resistances, bringing it back to back to, let's call it, what it looked like the day that Kristian won the Olympic.
Yeah. And you mentioned that long distance racing will at some point, maybe soon, be as competitive as short distance racing. So that implies, which I think is fairly clear if you follow both, that at this point short distance racing is slightly more competitive, more difficult to be successful in. Of course, the margins are generally slower, like the difference between a gold medal and a fourth place can be a few seconds. But why do you think that at this point it's still more competitive on the short course side? What is that down to? Is it the talent pool, just the format of the racing, or is it down to coaching quality or coaching methods, federation support?
I think it's a combination of all of them. Personally, I think it's a combination of all of them.
Let's put it this way: when you think that long distance racing will at some point in the next few years be as competitive as short distance racing, what are the things that are changing in long distance that is closing the gap?
So I think, of course, one of the things. Okay, so one key difference I do think there are between VTCS racing or Olympic racing and long course racing is that in long course racing, people, at least from if I try to have more like a helicopter perspective or outside perspective of it, I very often see that a lot of coaches and staff and people, athletes, everything that are involved in the long course racing are obsessing much more over details about IDs, measurements, and these kind of things, but really not able to bring it down to let's call it a sound or into a program that really makes them excel or go faster. In VTCS racing, you'll find a lot of coaches, really good coaches, that really they don't use much technology. They base it more or less on, let's call it, more empirical approach of what works and what doesn't work in this kind of thing. And they have to understand coaching, and they have to be maybe more pragmatic, more logic, maybe a little bit simpler even in their programming and so on. And of course, and I think that requires them also to see the people that they are working with also on a different level than what is normally in Ironman racing. I think that for a coach that are working this way and really learns to work without technology and then starts to bring in technology to answer specific things is a much bigger strength than going the other way around, where you just start to use technology. Or I think it requires a completely different skill set and it's more difficult to master. I don't say it's impossible to master, but I think it's more difficult when you are obsessing over details and some metrics, and one doesn't realize that actually there are more things that we are not able to measure than what we are able to measure. And this is the coach. When you are in a setting and you don't measure anything, you see the athlete. You just have to take the athlete into account. You see basically what they are doing. You are focusing on the main important metrics, and that is basically how fast do you cover a distance from A to B, which is really in the end the only thing that matters. And then trying to make that better, smarter, and so on. And then eventually you can put in more technology. So I think actually it comes down to that the coaches and the programs that are in VTCS racing are normally more adapted to or closer to peak human performance, how they work, than it is in Ironman racing. But this is, of course, what will change. And when you bring up both coaching and technology at the same level in both of them, then it will be impossible to transition equally fast from Olympic racing to a long course racing. Of course, we can't make this. It's not the same, of course, to compare it to a marathon and to a 1500 meter, for example. But you'll never find a 1500 meter runner that's going to go and win a marathon. And you're not going to find a marathoner that's going to win a 1500 meter. Of course, these are two different. This again is a different domains. So it's not really a good comparison, but it gives a picture of it. And that's the same thing that you'll see in Ironman too. The demands that are required in Ironman are different than what is required in VTCS racing. But when people really bring it closer to peak human performance, and where it has, then we are starting to look at margins there too. And those margins, you can't gain them in 3 weeks or 4 weeks. You can do a lot in 3 to 4 weeks, but you will never get the last part to become competitive. And that's exactly back to then what you say. Then the difference between the first place and the fourth place is not going to be minutes or tens of minutes anymore. It's going to be coming down to maximum minutes and maybe even seconds.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And it's really interesting to hear your perspective on it. Now, moving on to some training questions. The first thing I want to ask is, you mentioned already the racing schedule going from Kona, 7-on-3 Worlds in St. George, Bermuda, and then Abu Dhabi, and that was all in the last, I don't know, 6 weeks. Those 4 races, 7 weeks maybe. And I'm just curious, what makes Kristian and Gustav able to recover so quickly to do all of those races at very different levels of intensity as well? So, are there any things that you do outside of training, and how do you adjust training to make sure that to keep up with that race schedule, basically?
So I think there are, of course, a few key things. One of the main key things would be, for example, sheer volume. So obviously, for an athlete that doesn't train, and I'm exaggerating now a little bit, just but more a little bit to not prove, but get my point forward. And that is that if you take an athlete that trains 10 hours a week and he does an Ironman, that will be a major impact on him during that race. For an athlete that are doing 30 to 40 hours a week and then going into an Ironman, of course, an Ironman is going to be a tough, because you seldom do 8 hours or 7.5 hours of all out in your training one day. But of course, we try to bring it close to that. But that means also that now the volume, or let's say the load that you are getting in a single race compared to what your body is adapted to, the ratio between the two is not extreme. So that means also that the recovery time now after that one, compared to an athlete that are only training 10 hours a week and suddenly doing a race that is 10 hours in one day, that will have a completely different impact on it, because it's not adapted to doing something for 10 hours during one day. So here, one is purely what the athletes are adapted to. Secondly, I think also that we don't very much stress. I think that one of the biggest mistakes one very often do is that one doesn't have enough patience, or to put it another way, I think many athletes and coaches, they are stressing too much. A race like Kona is, on the one side, you can say it's a race, but it's also a huge stimulus to the body as well. So you're doing something that has a huge impact on your body. And allowing the body to adapt from this also is actually going to make you stronger afterwards too, if you time in now when you start to bring in the next training there. But starting to stress that you want to get in more and more workouts and you're trying to push it a little bit too early will most likely slow down the adaptation, and worst case, you don't get necessarily the adaptation or from the stimulus that you put yourself under during the race. So I would say 2 key things. One is listening, just discussing and having good dialogues with the athletes, and seeing a little bit when we start to bring up the training again, how they respond to the training. But again, don't be afraid of bringing it down if you really need to. But main reason for why we also can do this is because let's say the volume that they are adapted to, or the training load that they are adapted to, is of course on the edge of what you'll see even at the highest levels. I think that even when you compare on VTCS level or Ironman level, Kristian and Gustav is probably 2 of the athletes that are putting down some of the biggest volumes that we do see. And then of course, and of course other things as well. But I would say those are the 2 main components to it.
So a follow-up question on that. After Kona, for example, do you know roughly how many hours did Kristian and Gustav train in the week after, the 7 days after the race? And secondly, when did they do the first harder workout after Kona?
I should know because I'm making the programs and following up the training. But I have to admit that I don't. I have to go back in and look. But I do. Let me see. So after Kona, we had a few days of very easy training. Maybe it was approximately, but again, this is also one of the differences, because high intensity or high or medium intensity doesn't mean necessarily the same as a hard workout, because a hard workout is a combination by volume of medium intensity or high intensity. So you can have a few high intensity intervals during your session, and it's going to be an easy session. But if you start to bring up the volume of that, then it's going to be hard. In the same way as even a low intensity session is going to be hard at some point if you just put in enough volume on it. So if we just talk about in terms of hard, if we talk about it then in more of when did we really bring up the load again, that was probably only when it was 1.5 to 2 weeks left. We tried to bring in just a little bit of specificity in terms of then training load before the race there. But we gradually build it up towards that, and mostly the week after it was easy and more keeping it more on an enjoyable level. And then as they started to feel that the body was starting to respond again, we started to bring up the volume again, and the training load.
Yeah. And in terms of the training, if we can compare Kona versus what you will be doing now, focusing on the WTCS, and let's say maybe not now when the season is ended, but when you will be in the key phase of preparation for a race like the first WTCS race, what would a typical swim look like for the next WTCS race versus what would it have looked like for a key Kona preparation swim, just to compare and contrast a bit?
So key sessions, of course, are specific for us. I of course, you need to build a fundament around specificity. But if you have a good fundament around specificity, then I think specificity is the key. And that means, of course, that Kona, there you're looking to there you need to be able to swim fast, but you need to be able to swim fast for 3.8 kilometers. So typically key sessions there will be much longer intervals. We can have maybe some easier swims that are continuously close to 4 kilometer or around 4 kilometer. But let's say the more key sessions, they will typically be broken up into a little bit more into intervals. So they would typically then be shortest, maybe 500 meter, more 1,000 meters, for example. But we don't use very much of it. It's a rather low dosage of that that is required, because we are working on much shorter intervals, and that's more because of the nature of swimming modality itself. So it's much more interval based. But more the closer we get to the race, the more specific it becomes, and more specificity means basically you are going to swim 3.8 kilometers and then getting on your bike afterwards. So you need to adapt to that.
So 3.8 kilometers broken up into long intervals. What would the recoveries be if you do something like, I don't know, 4 times 1,000? How long recoveries would you have?
So then again, specificity would of course be 3.8 kilometers, or let's say 4 kilometers, without any recoveries. But since we are breaking up intervals, it means also that now the recoveries are very short. So typically it can be like 1 minute recoveries or something, maximum 2 minutes. But it's just to basically have a short break, do some sighting, get in some fuel if you have access to it, and then back into it again. Because we are not looking, again, specificity here is not coming the first 1,000. Let's say the specific stimulus we are looking for here is, for example, that your technique doesn't fall together when you are getting closer to 3.8 kilometers, but actually you are able to maintain a good technique also when you're getting closer to 3.8 kilometers. So if now you're bringing in a lot of breaks, you have longer breaks in between, like 5 minutes break or something like this, or between each of these intervals, it means also that you get enough time to really bring down everything from your core temperature, heart rate, everything in your body starts to normalize more again, and you are fresher, much fresher going into the next interval, which then can cause, let's say, a false positive impression of that, oh, this looks really good. But in fact, if you had just brought down the pauses between the intervals, you will suddenly see that the athlete is starting to fail after when it comes to 2,500 meters or something like this. And if that's going to happen in a race, that of course is really not good, because your race doesn't end when you come up of the water. You're actually pacing yourself in a way that this is just close to the warm-up of the whole race itself. So that means that you really have to be adapted to be able to execute a really good swim, and set yourself up for a perfect race rest of the day, because that's when the race is being decided. It's not being decided on the swim.
And what would the key swim for a WTCS look like?
So in VTCS racing, this is, of course, it would boil very much down to what kind of volume. We have been making bigger changes to the swimming program the last year than what we have done in, I would say, the last Olympic period in total. And we are still making more changes now, because we already have quite good insight into what the course is going to be in France. And we also have a pretty good idea about what the strategy of the French athletes are going to be. So we think absolutely that we need to bring up the speed more on the swim than what we have done in the past. I think one thing that we have to remember is that it's not being the fastest swimmer we see is not necessarily the people that are winning the races, but you have to be fast. You have to be able to stay in the front there. That's of course one of the things that we saw now in both in Bermuda, but also in Abu Dhabi, is that if you get a strong breakaway group, that of course requires you either to be strong enough to bridge up that gap there and then finish off strong, like Kristian did in the grand final in Edmonton last year when he took the world title. Then he came out of the water quite late, and then he basically bridged up the whole gap just on the last round. But of course, then he had the VTCS racing in his body. He was strong, or let's say he was specified for that kind of racing. While now coming back from Ironman racing, swimming became more critical for where you ended up in the last part of the race. So of course, this is something we are changing also now. So that means that typically key sessions more in leading into a race will again be more probably now, let's say, the same kind of version, but broken into a little bit shorter. Also, instead of that, you have 1,500 meter continuous, which also will be very specific, but it can also be now more 400 meters. You have like 4 times 400 meter, something like this, but again, also even shorter intervals again. So it's skewed a little bit more towards the, let's say, the higher velocity domain compared to when it is closer to an Ironman, where it's more into the little bit lower velocity, but more endurance domain.
For the WTCS swimming, is the expectation that the swim will basically be an all-out affair, and then you still need to be able to recover well enough, be able to bike strong, run strong? So would the training also reflect that if you do those 4 times 400, it would be basically 4 times 400 best effort? Or is there some kind of pacing element to it that you need to be able to swim 1,500 meters at 90 to 95%, not 100%, and still be fast enough?
No, I don't think it can be 100%. I think it has to be more in the domain of 95%. That's somewhere between 95 and 100%, to put it that way. 100% for sure not, but let's say around 95%. That's where and still be fast enough.
Yeah. And what about bike sessions, if you can describe a key session for Kona and a key session for WTCS?
So key session for Kona, it depends again the timing on where we are before the race, and if we need to make some adjustment. Let's say that everything is on track. Then typically key session for Kona would be, as you probably saw from Strava, the weekends before, 180 kilometer on the bike, close to race pace or race pace, or I make it simple, race pace. The same for running, it will be 40 kilometer run, so pretty much, but then also combined, not isolated, but actually combined with biking. So typically those days, the closer we get to a race, I will start to even use days as intervals. So in the same way that you take your training and you break your training, let's say your distance into intervals there, we are breaking also the race itself also into intervals, but more in the micro cycle. So that means that we can do swim, bike one day with a very short run afterwards, or skipping the run if necessary, and then the day after is going to be a specific bike and a specific run. So specific swim, bike one day, and then the next day or let's say shorter specific bike but specific run, for example, more or less to cover the full distance.
And both of those bikes on day 1 and day 2 would have a lot of specific race intensity in them, both the longer one.
Yeah. The only thing that would not be specific to it is basically the warm-up. The warm-up of the first one of them. So let's say that on the first day, they would maybe warm up a little bit on the swim first, but then go basically into a 4K swim. And then afterwards, they can have a little bit of a transition time, but then getting on the bike and then basically doing the 180K on the bike. But then you're already fairly warmed up, so you don't need a warm-up. You can just basically gradually bring you straight into race pace intensity. And the breaks that you're having there is basically just enough to fill up the bottles, make some measurements, and a short dialogue, and then it's off again. So maybe max a couple of minutes break, split into, let's say, 4 or 5 breaks. So let's say 4 breaks. So it would mean that you're doing 40 to 50 kilometers and then make a short measurement, stop, fueling up a little bit, and then off again after 1 to 2 minutes again. Run would be fairly much the same. So the day after, then it could typically be that the bike is getting a little bit shorter than the day before, because you already have now the swim and the bike also in your body. So keeping the bike maybe a little bit longer than half of it, but let's say 100K, and then basically doing the full marathon, but with again, same concept again, short breaks just to fuel up, make some measurement, have a short conversation, and then off again. So 1-2 minutes of break there as well.
Yeah. So would the intervals be something like 10 kilometers long before a short break, or how long would they be?
Yeah, that could be. Yeah.
Well, this is something you see a lot of people doing things like 20-minute repetitions at Ironman pace, or even 10-minute repetitions is not too uncommon to see. I get the sense that you think that that's just not a very smart, or not an optimal way of training. It's too short, because you're going to ride for 180 kilometers, which is 4 or 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours if you're an age grouper, depending on your speed, of course. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, because I think that we have to look at the limiters again. So if we look away from instruments, so if you have instruments, of course, then you will get the objective measurements of this if you know what to look for. But if you look away from that now, and you were looking, what are we actually trying to adapt the athletes to? Because the athletes obviously can run much faster than race pace if they just bring it down into shorter intervals. That's not a problem. And even if you bring down the volume of the session also to much shorter than what you're doing in racing, that also doesn't, you don't, because you're not really adapting towards, of course, there are always different cases so you have to look at it a little bit per case to case basis. But if we generalize it a little bit more, then we can say that what you really are looking for, and the big struggle, if you ask an athlete after he'd been doing an Ironman, when did things start to fall apart? for example. When was things really starting to be tough? For example, if you ask Kipchoge, for him running, if you ask him after 10 minutes of running, 21 kilometer power, 22 kilometer power, you ask him after 10 minutes, he would say, feels like a breeze, super easy. Half an hour later, you ask him, feels like a breeze. An hour later, probably still going to say, feels like a breeze. But now when you're getting closer to 30 kilometers and so on, he will start. And most likely now, the closer you get to the end of a race, for him also in a marathon, he will say this is a 10. I wouldn't be able to run a second faster on the kilometer than what I did. And that is because also RPE is it's a scale that are lacking one dimension, and that is time. Because you're looking at just something. Very often when we go into the lab or when we're doing some testing, we normally say that okay, so threshold should feel like 7 to 8. But so you have an idea that when you go at this speed, for example, this effort, this speed or this power, then or this velocity and this power, then basically okay that. When my threshold, then it should feel like a 7, 8, or if I do an Ironman, it should feel like 4, 5. But you're never gonna get over the finish line in an Ironman where you really have gone to your max and feel like it's a 5. You will feel it's a 10. You couldn't done anything more. So fatigue is something that I think too often is neglected because it's painful. We are a little bit afraid to maybe prescribe it in the training and these kind of things because, who knows? And if we neglect that, we will never get the stimulus or the adaptation required to really be able to excel. And that's why I think that let's say if we generalize, I would say that bringing it down in 2 short segments, you are not getting really the adaptation that you're looking for to do in a race. Because in a race, you're looking actually to be able to do 3.8 of swimming, 100 followed by a very short transition, 180 kilometers of biking, and then a very short transition to the run, where you're doing a 42 kilometer run. That is what you really are looking to do. And when you go out and you do a run a day, for example, and you have no fatigue in your body, you could even say that, well, doing only a 42 kilometer run should feel fairly easy at race pace when you have not done the biking up front and swimming before that again. So again, it comes very much down to where are the limitations of the athlete, but I think that for most of them, it comes down to being able to have execute with really good efficiency or technique, despite starting to have accumulate more and more fatigue in the body. And of course, there are other parameters that we'll come back to later on as well that I think will make this more obvious also for a lot of people when they are trying to specialize for these kind of races.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And in contrast, for a short course race, what would the key bikes and runs look like there?
So key bikes and run would again be more specific. This depends a little bit on what kind of training philosophy you have. But again, here, if we assume that you have a good fundamental round and that allows you to bring in a lot of specificity. The difference, of course, between VTCS racing and Ironman racing is that Ironman racing is much more stable racing. There are much less variation. Yes, there are some trying to do some breakaways. So you bring up the power a little bit to open up a gap. But again, the power variations there are very, very small. In VTCS racing, you have breakaways. You have people even doing pelotons. So there are more fluctuation in the racing and these kind of things. So specificity here is more bringing in the elements that we think are specific to, for example, Bermuda, Abu Dhabi, Yokohama, or Leeds, depending on where you're doing your racing. So, for example, before Bermuda, when we took the triplet in 2018, I believe it was, then we sat down and we assessed the course there, looked at, okay, where do we think that we can make a little bit of a shock to our competitors? And then basically we said, okay, if we know that we are really strong on the bike, we are some of the most powerful guys on the bike, for example. So, for example, if we go now into Corkscrew Hill or now Duffy Hill, and we go there close or around threshold power, we know already that the threshold power that we are putting out are higher than the rest of the people. So if they now want to do a breakaway up that hill, that's going to put a huge surge into them. So if we now position ourselves going in front of the group there, going into the hill there, putting on good power, and then we come over the top and you're already there, because now you get a little bit this, what you call it, stretch, you get a stretch effect because you come up the hill and there's a corner there. We know also that if you have now only a gap there already, a natural gap there coming out there, because you just get the stretch in the field of a couple of seconds, bringing up a gap of a couple of seconds when you're powering still now going comfortably at threshold. If you now have a stretch of a couple of seconds, that means that if you want to bridge up those couple of seconds of stretch, that means that you need to put out now 650 watts for those seconds to really to bring up that to bridge the gap there, and that's going to put an even bigger surge into the people there. So VTCS racing is much more dynamic. We have much less control of the field because you can always have an idea of that this is what we think can be some likely scenarios, but again you can face something completely different because the tactics and dynamics of VTCS racing is completely different. But that means also that the specificity there involves much more dynamics. You are still looking to cover close to, let's say, 40 kilometers in your training, but you are doing also back-to-back, maybe more intervals, but where we bring in more like a brick session of biking, running, but accumulating, let's say, around 40 kilometers on the bike, 10 kilometers on the run, but broken into, let's say, intervals with both elements, because the transition also is very critical in VTCS racing. Lose 5 seconds out of the transition zone in VTCS races, and you are already at a fairly big deficit between the best runners in the field.
Yeah, 5 seconds can it looks pretty scary when it's 40 meters up to the guy ahead. And that makes a lot of sense. I had a follow-up question on that. Oh, yeah, do you expect that you won't be able to be in the front group on the swim in every race? So do you train a lot to be able to bridge that gap maybe in the first couple of laps to close the gap to the leading group if there's an attempt at a breakaway, and just putting out really hard, consistent power for 10-15 minutes to try to get close or get to the front gap? Is that something that you train for?
So I look at this maybe in a little bit of a bigger equation. And that is that I know that one of the questions we will probably come into is a little bit maximum sustainable energy expenditure. But we can imagine that you have, but to make it, to simplify it, we can say that during a week, you have people are used to train a certain amount of hours. So let's say that's 25 hours a week, for example. Now, when you're training those 25 hours a week, in order to be able to execute as planned, it means also you need to recover well enough between those sessions to also, so that you are able to go according to the plan and progress throughout the plan. But that means also that what we are looking to do is the fastest triathlon. I think that, and of course this changes a little bit too, but it has to do a little bit with priorities. So it's not like we think that, okay, we need to prioritize more on the biking and go harder on the bike in order to be competitive. It's just that we say that we think that to win a triathlon, if we put too much effort into the swim, that's going to slow down the triathlon in general. Remember, Kristian won the VTCS grand final and the overall last year. He won the Olympics last year, but still he came out of the water 30 seconds slower than the rest of them, and even more, I think, in the VTCS. But let's say around 30 seconds in both of them. So this comes more down to having an idea of what will allow us to race the fastest with enough of, let's say, a room of play throughout the race, where we distribute this between swimming, biking, and running. And that means that, yes, if we say that now, okay, we think that we need to be faster of swimming, that's going to have a higher cost. So if it has a higher cost, that means that now we need to make some changes, other parts in the program instead. So if we see that the dynamics are changing completely, that, okay, now we come to a level where you really, because people are just super good to organize themselves in a peloton in the front, and it's difficult to get the group behind to organize in a peloton, then of course you need to move maybe some of that budget more over to swimming and be able to bring up the speed a little bit more there. But it is in more of a, let's say, more in a total equation than rather just saying that, okay, the swimming is where it is, because I know that we can make Kristian and Gustav faster swimmers, but the question is just does that gonna make the triathlon faster? and that is what matters in the end.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that leads to a follow-up question, which is, how do you distribute the training volume between the three disciplines, between swim, biking, and running? And is that different when you're preparing for short course versus long course?
Yes, that's different between short course and long course. I think that, and that also, it comes very much down to the importance of the different disciplines. Again, what's going to bring you to the finish line the fastest possible. And of course, in an Ironman, swimming represents a smaller fraction of the total race and has a less impact on the end result than it has in a VTCS race. So it means also that we can more of the focus can be on the bike and the run. And especially the run. But in VTCS racing, of course, swimming has a bigger. We prioritize more swimming relatively to the other sports.
Yeah. So, do you know off the top of your head a typical swimming week in meters for Kona versus when you're training for the grand final or something?
I don't remember exactly from the top of my head, but. I actually, it would be unfair of me just to throw out some numbers for the listeners. Yeah. But to put it this way, also we are also making bigger changes now to the Olympics. So the Olympic training that we did leading into Tokyo will be different going into Paris when it comes to the swim. So swim distances that we are doing now leading into Paris will most likely come down in volume or distance a little bit, but brought up a little bit more in velocity, just because of how the course is going to be and a little bit how, because the course is going to be, it's also easy to understand what the tactics are going to be, and that means also that swim speed probably have to be a little bit higher as well for the athletes. So the volume is going down relatively to the previous Olympic cycle. A little bit more focus, slightly bring it up on speed or velocity. But I would say that in general, effective swimming time is approximately 7 hours a week. That's what I would say, effective swimming hours.
Yeah. What is it about the course in Paris that leads to those changes? I haven't actually seen the course, so
it's not official yet, or it's not published yet. But they are swimming in the river next to or very close to the Eiffel Tower, and then the course seems to be will be close to a TT course with very little technical parts there. And let's say now you have an athlete that you decide is going to be your captain, and then you take the rest of the national team and just use them as domestics, or the two other athletes as domestics. Obviously, if you are a fast swimmer, you're looking now to just maintain your gap after the swim all the way out. And of course, the French, they are strong swimmers. So then when we, at least we can infer that that's one possible scenario that's going to happen. Then that means also that we need to set up for a little bit faster swim, trade off a little bit on the other ones, because this is not a solo race. It is a race where there is a lot of dynamics and other people into the mix that can make all the differences to the race.
Yeah, and if you had to speculate, of course, there's still a year and a half or more until the Olympics, but if the Olympics happen next summer, who would be the French captain? Would it be current world champion Leo Berger or double world champion Vincent Louis, who was one of the big favorites before Tokyo?
No idea.
Yeah, fair enough. But they do definitely have a strong enough team that they will have a strong captain and they will have strong domestiques either way.
Absolutely. The French are really they are superpower in triathlon for sure.
Yeah. Let me see here, because I did have a section on questions about swim training, because we have talked in previous interviews quite a lot about bike and run training, and I'm just checking which I guess one question, when you were preparing for Kona, how many swims would you do per week, and how many of them would be kind of key sessions or harder swims?
So I don't periodicize normally on a week basis. Or microcycles doesn't take into account whether there's Saturday, Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday, or whatever weekday it is. So it depends a little bit more on what we are working on. So we can be working on everything from a microcycle, which only is 2 days, all the way up to even longer than a week. But I would say that in general, if I were making a statistic, you would maybe see during a week 2 to 3 harder sessions. 2 to 3 harder sessions. Let's say 2. If I just had to go by a number, I would say 2 harder sessions during let's say a normal week or 7-day week. Yeah.
And I'm guessing with 7 hours of effective swim time, that would normally be 6 sessions or 6 workouts total, maybe 5 some weeks, but probably something like that.
Yeah.
And other than we talked about specific Ironman preparation swims. Were Kristian and Gustav also doing some swims targeting other aspects, maybe specific limiters for their swimming, whatever that might be, or was it all quite specific?
No. We had some interventions targeting specific also limiters for Kristian and Gustav too, but we normally try to bridge it into the specificity too. So it's more, call it more like something they focus on, and then we work more around it, or we try to bridge it as much as possible into specificity, or we put it into the sessions that are around the specificity.
And what were those limiters?
For Kristian, he has some limiters to his to more of his movement in his upper body because of his purely just due to structural how it's built structurally. So we need to work around it a little bit. So there it comes more down to some focus areas when he's not in the pool, but also in the pool. But for periods, for Gustav, it's more the technical aspect. So there is more about bringing up. Typically, when he goes up to a higher, he is an extremely good, call it a low intensity swimmer. He is extremely efficient there. He is extremely efficient when you go up to high speed, but in the race specific domain, that's where he's suffering the most, and that's where we are more there. It's more about bringing in the mental awareness of what really is changing there, and then gradually bringing in, let's say, that inflection into slightly higher speeds gradually as we build.
And in your swimming, how do you control the intensity? Is it, because that's something that we talked about as well in past interviews with RPE being something that you always use, but also lactate, heart rate, speed, all of those things. How does it work in swimming? Is it any different than in running and cycling, or is it very similar? And can you just describe a bit how you use it?
So in swimming, it's speed oriented or time oriented. Or velocity. So that is, of course, one parameter, but it depends a little bit on what kind of session. If it's a specific session, then of course velocity or time and distance is basically what dictates most the session, and then you try to but basically time distance is the key parameter. But on the sessions around and a little bit further away from the race, then it's more. Then of course we use much more tools. So of course I use VO2. But the main and lactate, we use instruments. We have a very close cooperation with Form Goggles now, where we are making some new versions now that allows us to have more of the metrics real time in the goggles. Because this is, for me, swimming is a underdeveloped sports for sure. Imagine in running and biking now, you can look at your computer and you have real time biofeedback on what you're doing, your pacing, your everything from your pacing, cadence, heart rate, whatever you are deciding to focus on there. While in swimming, we never have this kind of feedback. And even as a coach on the side of the deck, it's very hard to really give specific feedback to the athlete while they're swimming. If they now can swim and they can see this real time in the goggles, this is something that allows them to connect much more what they're doing with their feelings too, and know whether things are right or wrong. Or not, let's say not right or wrong, but if they're on target, both on intensity, but also on target on the technique. Put it this way: if you take an athlete and you say that, okay, I want you now to rotate 45 degrees in the pool, and you film him, he for sure that athlete's going to have that, think that he's rotating 45 degrees, but in reality you'll find very few that do. And when you are now saying, okay, so let's exaggerate it, let's bring it to 60 degrees rotation in the pool, for example, now, just to learn awareness of your body. The changes they make are so small, and they think that they're almost falling or tipping over, but maybe it's just a balance issue or really a strong disconnection from what is really happening in reality and and in their perception or feeling. So we use instruments, and we are bringing more and more instruments there to get more and more specific. Lactate, of course, is something we use quite frequently, especially on the easy session. We use it more to see that things are slow enough, or we make changes to the program. On the key sessions, then we are looking more to maybe see further away from the races. It's more, let's say, the metabolism that dictates the speed or speed in the pool, while the closer we get to the races, then it's more the speed that dictates there. But also further away from the races, since we're using quite a lot of instruments like lactate and so on, the athletes really have a good connection between where they are also.
Yeah, that all makes sense. One follow-up question on that: when you're preparing to win Kona, you have to bike a certain speed, or you have to run a certain speed. You have to swim. That's actually more varied depending on the conditions, of course. The bike can also be varied, but the swim is more about being in the right group. So when you do sessions in the pool, and you have a certain velocity target, is it more a fact that that, okay, if we can do these 1,000-meter intervals with short rests on a certain speed, and it feels like it's the right intensity, it's not going all out, then we know we will be in the right group? Or is it, or can you actually make a translation between the pool speed and the open water?
You can make a translation between, because if it's rougher weather outside, it's going to be slower for everybody. And most people swim in the pool anyway. So in that sense, you can make a translation, of course, between what's happening in the pool and what's happening open water. Not necessarily that you can do a direct translation, saying that, okay, if you swim this fast in the pool, you're going to swim this fast in open water, but more that that, okay, if we stay at this target if we stay at this target velocity in the pool for this distance or this kind of type of workout, then that you are going to be in the first pack also or the first group also when you come into the water, independently of conditions. So it's more about knowing what kind of or having an idea of what kind of capacity does the athlete have or need to have with some reserve to be in the position in the water independently of the conditions. Yeah,
makes sense. I know you have a meeting coming up soon, so we have a lot of other questions, and maybe we can make time for another interview to do a second part. Might be after Christmas, because we're coming up on that as well. But
for sure,
let's do a few short questions. First, the final one before the rapid fire questions is: when we chatted last time, I asked you, what's your favorite piece of gear or equipment? And you answered that I can't tell you until after the Olympics. So, yeah, can you tell me now? What is your favorite piece of gear or equipment?
I'm actually more interested to because you wrote in the email that you thought, or that you might have an idea on it.
I thought that maybe it's the core temperature sensor because of the role that heat played in Tokyo preparations, and I know you've used it not just for heat adaptation and temperature monitoring, but also energy monitoring. So is that the one?
Yes and no. It was one of them, but actually the core, or now to avoid the confusion here, actually one of the most interesting thing that we did last year, last Olympic cycle, and we are continuing to work on now, is that we are developing a software that allows us to put all these kind of things into a bigger picture in a much easier sense than what we have been able to do before. And that, I think, that is maybe the key very often, because even for me, I only have a limited time available, and then being able to put all these sensors, all this data into a bigger picture, and being able to make sense of it out of it is actually one of the things that are, I think, the biggest fun, but also where it makes it even easier to individualize the training, both in terms of efficiency or technique, but also load for the athletes as well. So it is actually soft. It actually is software is the core of it all.
Okay. Yep. Well, that's a good answer. And rapid fire questions. These are new ones, not the same that you answered last time. The first one is: what is your favorite place to train?
Home or Font-Romeu.
And what is a bucket list race or event that you would want to do?
Get fitter. I don't do races.
And finally, if you could acquire expert level in any skill in the world for yourself in an instant, what would it be?
Reading human brains.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah. All right. Olav, thank you so much for this. I hope that we can get back to some other questions that we still have to cover, maybe in another interview, a follow-up one.
Absolutely.
But thank you for this. This was great. And where is the best place for listeners to follow you and your work?
Actually, my days are basically so packed that I have on my list to become better at social media. But I really do struggle with finding time to it. And one of the main reasons why I want to find a little bit more time for social media is actually to bring forward all the great people that I have around me that are making this happening. Everyone from Ørjan Madsen, which brought me into this, to now the whole team that is working on everything from the software to our partners and so on, and really just tell a little bit, let's say, my personal story with these people and bringing them forward. So hopefully that's going to be, I know, probably LinkedIn and Instagram, because it's very easy for people just to follow there. Twitter, but I've deactivated my Facebook and Messenger because I don't have time for it. I even would like to quit a lot of other stuff as well because I don't have time for it. But I think probably Twitter, Instagram, and for, at least Instagram and LinkedIn is probably the two places where I will try to find more time to really bring forward all the people that is, because they are truly amazing people, not just what they do in business, but also on the side. They add so much energy to me and the team that it really makes me humble.
It takes a village to produce exceptional results, for sure, exceptional performances.
Yeah.
Thank you again. It was great to chat, and hope to do it another time soon.
Thank you so much.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. I think personally that following how Kristian and Gustav will do going back to short course racing will be definitely the most interesting thing in professional triathlon racing next year. So it's great to get some first-hand insight into how they will go about their training and racing preparation. I know a lot of fans of the sport think that they should stay and do long course, or they should do Kona even if they focus on short course. I'm not at all of that opinion. I will love to see them focusing fully on short course racing and see how they do when they really go 100% all in for that type of racing towards the Olympics in Paris in 2024. Because of Olav having a meeting to go to right after the interview, we didn't get through all of the questions I had prepared. We got through a bit more than half of them, I think. So one of the main topics I still would like to ask him about would be his thoughts on effective training for amateurs and a bunch of sub-questions and topics to that. So hopefully we can come back to that and other questions in the not too distant future. We'll try to schedule something. But until then, you can find the show notes for this episode on scientifictriathlon.com with the link to Olav's social media and the past episode that we did, episode 264, and also the interviews that I've done with Iden Tveiten, who is the head coach and sports director of Team Norway. So I've done 3 interviews with him. Those are all also related to the training of the Norwegian athletes that we discussed here, Kristian Blummenfelt and Gustav Iden, of course. Also something that I want to remind the listeners of that I think many are not aware of is that I do write a weekly newsletter where I put together my own thoughts and key takeaways from each podcast episode. So if you go to scientifictriathlon.com and sign up at the footer of the website, you can get my thoughts on this one on Thursday, which is 3 days after the episode is released, and of course all future interviews as well. Next Monday is the 26th of December, and it's still TBD, but probably I will do some kind of year in review episode. Still figuring out the details of it, so stay tuned for that. I hope that you will listen in as usual. And I also want to remind you of our Mallorca training camp at the end of March. We still have slots available, and I would say that if you've never trained in Mallorca or you've never been on a group training camp, then really consider this one because it's quite a fantastic experience. You can find all of the information on scientifictriathlon.com, and if you have any questions, just email me. Big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelandhydration.com. Use their free fuel and hydration planner to understand your fluid, electrolyte, and carbohydrate needs, and get a specific and effective race strategy, and book a free video consultation with the team if you want to refine it further. Use the code TTS22 at checkout for 15% off your first order of fueling and hydration products. And thank you to Zen8. Use the Zen8 swim trainer to improve your technique, power, stamina, and swim training consistency. You can try the Zen8 risk-free for up to 30 days and get the special Zen8 and TTS bundle, including the swim trainer and a number of Zen8 training plans and on-demand workouts on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. As the next episode will be after Christmas, I'm not sure when to say Merry Christmas. Is it before or is it after? I'll guess I'll do it once now and once in the next episode. So Merry Christmas, and thank you for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.